I often hear people say, these are unprecedented times. Well, they're not really. I mean, we've been here before. Well, not you and I, but our ancestors have been many, many times before. That's because history repeats. It does so in predictable time periods. We call those periods natural cycles. In this presentation, I'm going to provide you with an introduction to the cycles of history. A cycle is like a sine wave. Now let's take climate. Temperature historically fluctuates up and down. You can think about annual weather. In winter it's cold, in summer it's hot. One full cycle goes from top to top. But one more element must be present. That's periodicity. What that means is a cycle must repeat in the same time frame over and over. Each year, for example, is 12 months. From summer to summer, from hot to cold and to hot again. That's a cycle, and it's predictable. Within these cycles, there are differences cycle to cycle. History and climate don't repeat exactly the same way twice. Rather, we say that history rhymes. You have different players, for example, politicians and leaders in each different cycle. Donald Trump is similar in many ways to Henry VIII. He lived in a similar time with similar things going on. Henry VIII was battling the Roman Catholic Church in Rome, while Trump battles the deep state, China, and the World Economic Forum, or central bankers. They both had several wives and over-the-top personalities, to say the least. If you know that cycles repeat, you can predict the future to some degree, because the underlying patterns tend to be similar. For example, over the past year, we've had authoritarianism across the world, tyranny in many cases, all these lockdowns going on and on with no underlying science to support them. The climate is warm and dry, which is typically when you see tyranny develop. It was very warm and dry in Hitler's day, for example. Remember the hot and dry dust bowls of the 1930s? Another trait of hot, dry climate tops is weak leaders. We have them across the world. Also, populist leaders. Trump is considered a populist leader. So was Herbert Hoover on the cusp of a depression. You go back to the Depression of 1835 in the US, for example, and there was another populist leader, Andrew Jackson. He was president just before what became known as the Panic of 1837, which was a great big stock market crash. As president, he fought against the corrupt aristocracy and to preserve the Union of the United States. He fought for the common man. History rhymes. That was a cycle of 172 years, which is a depression cycle. There's also a 515-year cycle. We're at the top of this warm, dry cycle right now. The traits that you find now were similar to the traits and resulting events 500 years ago. So if you understand where we are in a cycle, you can use the past to predict the future. In fact, what's going on in the world right now was predicted over 100 years ago. You can do the same thing. I'm going to give you an idea of how that works. One of the quotes that I like to use with cycles is this well-known quote by George Santayana. Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Well, most of us have a sense that history repeats, but most of us also don't pay any attention to history. Some do, however. One of those was Lee Iacocca, the past CEO of Chrysler in the 1980s. He turned around a company facing bankruptcy and it became a leader in the industry. And before that, he worked for the Ford Motor Company and came up with the Mustang, one of the most successful and iconic cars in history. He said, as far back as I can remember, I've always been a strong believer in the importance of cycles. You'd better try to understand them, because all of your timing, and often your luck, is tied up in them. Cycles tell you when to buy a home and when to sell, for example. The same with the stock market. Now that's just the tip of the iceberg. In this presentation, I'm going to introduce you to cycles and show you how they repeat throughout history, using two examples. We'll visit the top of the Roman Empire when it was really warm and dry, and the warm, dry top of the Elizabethan England in the 1500s, which marked the end of feudalism. Now, hopefully, seeing the similarities and how these cycles dictate what happens to the economy, to climate, to social mood, to politics, and so much more, you'll get interested in the natural world around you. You too can predict the future based on a knowledge of the past. As I always say, know the past, see the future. Now let's get started. Let's go look at a cycle. You know that the moon goes around the Earth in 27.3 days. And when you get a full moon, that's about every 29 days, any policeman or nurse will tell you that people go absolutely crazy. It is a wild couple of days whenever there's a full moon. And you can see the same thing in the stock market. I analyze the stock market daily, and whenever we have a full moon, typically the market will go up. And it's what is called an excitability index. At least this gentleman thought so, Alexander Shazevsky. He was a Russian scientist that lived in the late 1800s and into the mid 1900s. And he studied the sun for most of his life, did a tremendous amount of writing about the sun, and he found that mass excitability index with the sun as well. Stalin didn't really like what he was talking about and the kinds of things he was saying, so he threw him in the gulag for 8 years. So this guy had a very tough life. It's like the truth. Some people just don't like the truth. I know all about that. In any case, he studied the sun and sunspots, and he determined that the sun goes through cycles. Now, it's interesting that the sun is 400 times larger than the moon, and it's also 400 times further away. So you can think of the influence of the sun somewhat the same as the moon, although the sun with its heat has a lot more influence on the Earth. But they both give out electromagnetic rays, and electromagnetic rays also affect us. And I'm going to be talking more about that as this presentation goes on. But if we go look at these cycles a little bit further and look at this mass excitability index, I had said that there's an 11.2-year cycle with the sun, and that's the solar cycle, and every 11.2 years, the sun gets very, very active, and you can see these spikes. This is the year 2000, and you get very wild things happening, but on a much grander scale than the moon. For example, at this high here, this solar cycle high from about 2000 to 2004, we had all kinds of plane crashes. We had buses falling off mountains. There was a market top up in here, the 2001 what do they call it, the dot-com phase, and so we had a market top there, and then it came down. We had the Concorde crash was in this period. A lot of airlines came down. We had the beginning of the Iraq War. Those types of things happen, and they typically happen around the top of these cycles. Now, if I was to go back 11.12 or 11.2 years back, there was a cycle around 1969. And at the top of that cycle, we had Woodstock, and I was at Woodstock, and so you could see on that cycle a very clear spike, and at the top of that spike was the Woodstock celebration with 250,000 people. Going back and going another 11.2 years from 2000, we get to 2010 through 2014, and you can see we had a spike here, the Sandy Hook, Kenya murders, bus crashes were in here, the Syrian conflict we had. It didn't happen in here when there wasn't any very active sun. It happens at the top. Arab Spring started here and got more intense as time went on. Flight 370, Korean Ferry, all of these things happened in this particular time frame, and that's the excitability factor that you'll get every 11.2 years. But now the sun is getting cooler. You can see that in 2014 this spike here wasn't as high as this one, and now we're getting them that are very much smaller, and that means that the sun is getting cooler. So we're not going to have as many of these crazy things happening because we're not going to have this excitability factor that is going to be as intense as it was in the past. Looking at the bigger picture, here's looking at 1700 through 2100, and the sun also has larger cycles where it gets hot. You can see it in here, hot, and then it gets cooler. Hot and cooler, and it'll do this over time. We've had a very hot spell over the last 100 years from about 1900. Well, this was a little cool and hot in here. And in fact, 1929 was a very, very cold year when we had the stock crash. And when we have very cold, dry years, you tend to get markets that go down in price. Well, here you can see we've had a big run, and now it's actually getting cooler, is what I was telling you in that last chart. and we're going to go into what we call this was the Maunder minimum, but a mini ice age, and it'll take about 500 years to get to the bottom of it, and it's going to be cooler. So your summers are not going to be as warm as they were. Winters are going to be cooler, and that's right across the Earth. Edward R. Dewey was prominent in the 1930s. He was born just before 1900. And he spent a lot of his life trying to figure out how many cycles there were and how they worked. And how that happened was that was really interested in why there were so many depressions in the 1930s, because they had a depression like clockwork every 20 years, and there's an 18-and-a-half-year cycle that would be the one that was working during that period. Hoover wanted to know why those depressions kept happening. Now, Dewey happened to be the head of the finance department, and when Hoover lost the presidency in 1930, he went out on his own and determined to figure out what was going on with cycles. And he put together, wrote a number of books. This is one of them, and it's probably the most popular, Cycles, the Science of Prediction. So you can still get this. It's a great starter book on cycles, and he discovered 3,500 cycles. I think of him as the father of cycles. And in 1942, he founded the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, which I was the executive director for in 2016, just a few years ago, and they have got a ton of information. The website is still on the internet, so you can find that, and there are a lot of files that go back many years, but all of the information on cycles, if you're really interested, is still there, and it's all free. The next gentleman I want to introduce you to is really one of the key figures in cycles, and that was Dr. Raymond H. Wheeler. Now, he worked at the University of Kansas. He was the professor there, a PhD in psychology, and he wrote a number of books on psychology, so he's published in that area. But midway through his career, he really got involved or interested in how climate influenced human beings, and started to do a study on climate. And I learned about him through my work with cycles, because he is cited in a number of books on cycles as being one of the more important figures. But he never actually published his work in climate, even though he had 200 people working for him at one particular time. And what he did was he put together a large book, and I'll just take you through this. This is actually a book, Climate, The Key to Understanding Business Cycles, written by the head of the American Stock Exchange, Michael Zahorchak. And so this was using a lot of Wheeler's notes and his work, but Dr. Wheeler didn't actually write a book himself. He had one that is actually sitting in Baruch College in New York, that is not fully published, but it's a draft, and I've gone through 2 of his drafts, and I have copies of all of his charts on climate, so it's really quite spectacular. But here's his book. He worked on a book called The Big Book, and it is about 2,000 pages. If you open it, it's about 7.5 feet wide from one end to the other. If you were to open it across this counter, this is what it looks like inside. So he wrote a lot of this in his own handwriting, and you can see the green letters here, or green text, has to do with cooler weather, and warmer weather is in the warm text. So he went back. The main portion of his work is from 600 BC through to about 1942. Here are just a picture of his books that he was writing and just never got published. It was interesting that when he died, or before he died, he talked to his wife, and he was somewhat disappointed that he'd never published anything with all of the work that he'd done, about 20 to 30 years of work in the climate area. And as I said, he had 200 people working for him at one time. And he told her to burn all of his work, and my goodness, thank God she didn't, because it is still, took me about 2 years to actually find the big book, but it's at Baruch College in New York City, and it's an amazing, he's quite a brilliant man, an amazing amount of work. You can see one of his charts here, which I've taken most of his charts now, and I have upgraded them to make them more colorful and brought them into today's digital environment. So if we go back to what he came up with, it really works from the cycles that we have during a year. And you know these cycles. They're spring, summer, fall, and winter. You can always count on them. Each one of them is about 3 months long. They vary a little bit, but we have spring that is warm and wet, and then you have summer that gets drier, but it gets hotter and drier. Then you have fall and it gets cool and wet, and then you have winter that gets cold and dry. So these are important elements of climatic cycles, and they also tell you a lot about what is going to happen in society. So cold weather gives you energy. Dry weather is drought weather, and that has a problem. We have problems with food during dry weather. Wet is prosperity, so you always have major empires growing when it is very wet and it is warm. And when it gets hot, people get lethargic. So between cold with energy and hot with lethargic, it tells you an awful lot about what is going to happen. Now, that is in a normal year. But what he found out is that these things go on a much grander scale in terms of time. So if you look at these cycles, you can think of them as sine waves. And these are the major cycle lengths for climate. There are other cycles. For example, I mentioned to you there's the 18.5-year real estate cycle in here. Actually, it'd be just down in here. But these are the key ones. 172 years is a depression cycle. 515 years is a civilization cycle. So you always get an empire at the top of these that falls apart. And right now it's the American Empire. But one of the points I want to make here on this chart is that the larger cycles always trump the smaller ones. So you might think of this little set of cycles down in here as the annual seasons. When it gets drier or colder on the downside and it's a 1,000-year cycle, it trumps these cycles at the bottom. So these cycles still go on, but it means that your seasons are going to get colder, and that is through summer and winter. So we've had years, for example, in the 1600s in England where they had one year called the summer without summer, or the year without summer, and the summer was very cold during that particular year. And in fact, in the Maunder Minimum, the Seine River froze up in the winter. So that's how cold it does get during some of these downturns. And where do these things come from? Well, of course, they come from the planets, these cycles. I talked about the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. It's every 171.4 years. And there's a very definite 172-year cycle. So that one comes from that. There's a 1,500-year cycle that is the conjunction of Neptune and Uranus and Saturn. So depending on where these planets are at particular times, you get these cycles taking hold, and they last a very long time. There's also a ratio. There's something called the golden mean. If you're in art, you know what the golden mean is, but it's the ratio of 618, 62%. You can think of it that way. And it's reciprocal of 38%. So 62 plus 38 equals 100 or 100%. And these two figures, or these two numbers, are all through the stock market. The other thing is, and when you get into the stock market and you see that all of your measurements for all of the waves in the stock market usually have a relationship to 62%, this comes from the ratio of the distances between the planets. So if you were to go measure all these distances between these planets and then average them, it comes to 0.618. So there's your influence on Earth, and it's through virtually everything. Our DNA has these same measurements in it. You would find that even our arms and legs have measurements based on this relationship to, for example, your elbow and the one part of your arm to the other part of your arm have these Fibonacci, call them Fibonacci relationships, but 62% is called the golden mean, and it's all through artwork, all through other technical aspects. It's how plants grow. It's through almost everything that happens on Earth. Now, Dr. Wheeler did his work by looking at tree rings. And tree rings and some of the, like the sequoias and those very large trees, the trees that are in Southern California, he went and worked with those. He had a team of us, had 200 people, and they went through all of these tree rings. They're very accurate. Each one of these rings would be a year. And of course, these trees get very, very large. And so they can go back and they can figure out whether it was a warm year, a cold year, lots of rain, that sort of thing. And by being very specific on that, they get a very accurate reading of the climate over a very long period of time. There's another process that does the same thing, and that's using ice cores. So you can go to somewhere like Iceland, for example, or Greenland, and you can drill way down into the ice and you can get these ice cores. And there is an element of oxygen that is in these that fluctuates based on whether it is warm or cold or whatever else is happening in the atmosphere at that time. And you can analyze these and get another very accurate representation of what the climate is over very long periods of time, hundreds of thousands of years. They go back a long, long time. So using those two methods, now Dr. Wheeler used the tree rings and he also used a lot of data and information. For example, the Chinese going back into 13,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, that sort of thing, used to record the climate. And so there are accurate records back then. There don't tend to be accurate records when we go into periods like the Dark Ages. And those tend to not be very good times that people keep records. So it's spotty, but you have tree rings all the time, and you have ice cores all the time. And so you can get a pretty good accurate reading. This is looking at the climate. You can see this is my little sine wave down here, is to give you an idea that it does sort of go like a sine wave. And if you were to go back to the last glacial period, there were the ancient Egypt that came up here, and it was very warm during this period, and then it got very cold, and then there was a new ancient Egypt, New Kingdom, which was in a very warm period. But you tend to have these ice ages that happen here, and you can see my blue little half an egg to the bottom here, and there's another one here. This is the new one we're expecting, where you get very warm periods and then you get very cold periods, warm, cold, warm, cold. And at the tops of all of these warm periods, you get these empires. And it's always the empires that form when it is warm and wet, where you have lots of food, it's great weather, and once you get to the top and it turns cold and dry, they tend to self-destruct and go right back in. We call these little blue areas here Dark Ages and our Ice Ages. This one was the Little Ice Age, called the Maunder Minimum, back in the 1600s, and we're going to touch on that when we get into England. And here we are today, where we have the modern warm period, and of course we got the empire of the day, which is the American Empire, which is starting now to fall apart, and we're going into another cold period. So these things go up and down, and so we had this great big climate scare, if you want to call it that, the man-made warming climate thing, and you find that humans, whenever it gets a little bit colder, like in the 1970s, it got cold and dry and the market didn't do well. People thought we were going to go into an ice age then, and when you get these very warm periods, you find that people go off the deep end and they think it's going to keep going up and up and up forever, but it doesn't. They move in a sine wave, and this is the way the climate has always been, and gradually it is getting cooler. All right, the sun is getting cooler, and so some of these very deep cold periods are getting colder. So I don't really like what's going to happen in the next 500 years. But, in your lifetime, you're not going to see that dramatic a change. But over the next 500 years, it'll finally get to a bottom in terms of cold. So that is what we're going to look at in a little more detail. I'm just going to take this section here, going from the end of the Egyptian kingdom, and I'm going to show you more in-depth pattern all the way up to today, and it won't go into this little blue area here, but it'll be up to the top of the American Empire. So here's what we have to start with. If you think about the temperature. This is the temperature pattern here that you're seeing over thousands of years. This goes back from about the year minus 2000 or BC, 2000 BC, up until about today, 2000. So it's about 4,000 years, so 2020, and this is the top of the American Empire. These cycles are about 1,000 years. In here, so you can see 1,000 years, 1,000 years, and these are highs in the temperature. All right, gives you an idea. We've always talked about Rome being very, very warm, for example, much warmer than it was today. Everybody thinks that this was some sort of anomaly when it got this warm. Well, no, it's actually cooler than it has been in the past, and that's what these come from ice cores. This is the GIS P2 data that in the 1990s, 3 countries got together and they went to Iceland and they did this drilling and they came up with this pattern. Now, interestingly enough, Dr. Wheeler, when he did his tree rings, came up with exactly the same pattern. Now, his is much more specific in that his charts go for a period of about 100 years, some of them, and some of them 250 years, but it gives you all of these fluctuations, and they're exactly the same as what we have here. So these come from ice cores in the 1990s. Dr. Wheeler's work comes from the 1930s and from tree rings. And so there's 2 sources of data that are giving me exactly the same thing. And so when I move forward and I start to put in the various empires that grew up during this period. See, this is the same period of the warm temperatures up in here. So this is your temperature pattern, and you can see how this relates to ancient Egypt. It grew when it got very, very warm and then sort of self-destructed on the way down here. And classical Greece was in here. It was more just in this little area, and then this began because Rome took over Greece and conquered Greece, and so that became part of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was very warm at the very top, and so there was a major empire, and then it just gradually fell apart as it got colder and drier. And one of the interesting things is that bad things start to happen when you get at the very bottom of these cold and dry periods. We have Rome burning and Hadrian's Wall, which was built in England, actually, to keep out the Scots at the very bottom. But you also have these sorts of things that happen later on, for example, after the British, well, it was really the English Empire and Queen Elizabeth, and it got very, very cold. We called this period down in here the Maunder Minimum. And at the bottom of it, in 1663, you had the Great Fire of London, and then you got the bubonic plague there, and a big stock market crash. Didn't really have a stock market, but grain prices got really high at that point. And so you have these types of anomalies at the bottoms. So that was the end of the Roman Empire, going back over here. And then you had the rise as it got warmer again, with Justinian at the top of the, think of this as the Eastern Roman Empire, became the Byzantine Empire, and the Mayans also had their little empire, large empire at the top. And people wonder why the Mayan Empire failed. Well, of course, it got cold and dry again. But again, what's interesting is you have, Jesus Christ at the top when it started to get cold at the end of the Roman Empire, and you had the same thing with Muhammad starting up the Islamic religion just as it started to get cold again as the empire was starting to fall apart. So you can think what's happening in today's world, where you're getting all of these, everybody's questioning what's going on, and we have this major change, and we have authoritarianism, which you always get at the tops of these warm, dry cycles, and who knows, we may get over here another religion starting up. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, because that's generally what happens. Then we went into another Dark Ages, and you can see that these drops in temperature happen a little differently. You usually get a very quick drop. When I say very quick, this takes a couple of 100 years at least. And this one kind of went up and down again and reached a lower low down here. The entire trip to the downside very often takes about 700 years. This was the British Empire bottom, for example, and the 13 colonies in the U.S. happened at a very low point in terms of temperature down in here. But you have different lengths of time you can never really tell how long it's going to take to get right down to the bottom. This would have been the Maunder minimum in here in 1663. And that then started back up again. So you have these empires that start to fall apart. The interesting thing, or there's many interesting things, different traits that happen. The authoritarianism happens at the tops of all of these empires when it's warm and dry. At the bottoms, you move towards democracy again. And so you get things like habeas corpus coming in. There are other concessions that happen. For example, you'll get the Magna Carta, which was in 1215. So you can see that's just about here. And there are other concessions that come from the government as we move towards democracy as it gets colder. So you had the Norman Conquest, 1066, up here at another high, and then it gradually got colder and drier. We had the Viking Age. Here you can see this purple area as it was getting warmer, and that was Iceland and Greenland. And Greenland, I always say to people who talk about this global warming, I say, well, why do you think they called Greenland Greenland? Because it was warmer at the top here, and the Vikings actually settled there, had settlements, and it was green pastures, and it hasn't been the way it is now for all that long historically, really. Then it got colder, and we had a renaissance. Even in these cold periods, you do have other empires that come up. This was a 172-year top here, and then it got colder, and then we got the 13 colonies in here, and then, of course, we went up into the American Empire, which is we're at the top of right now. But you always have international wars going to the upside as these empires expand, and as they collapse, you have civil wars on the downside. So we're going to go into civil wars. Another interesting thing that we had was the printing press happened before the English Empire. That was in the 1300s, and we've also had, before a high here, 172-year high, we had the internet before our 515-year high, which is also a 172-year high about 40 to 50 years ago. So there's an awful lot of similarities that you find as we go through these ups and downs in climate. Now, the other side of the coin are the dark ages, and this is the same chart, but it's more concentrating on the cold periods, which are these periods here. And in these cold periods or dark ages, and this was actually a little ice age over here, it's called the Maunder minimum, you know what you get is like real pandemics. These are pandemics that kill millions and millions of people all over the world. And we've had these historically whenever it gets cold and dry. Now, you know that we get the flu epidemic, if you want to call it that, in the wintertime when it is cold and dry. And the same thing happens with these pandemics. But you only get them when it gets really cold and dry. And in these long periods, this was about 700 years to the bottom here. This was only a couple of hundred years to the bottom of cold here, and it didn't get that cold. But we still got these pandemics, and you can see them in purple. Typhus, cholera, influenza were down at the bottom here. And we just don't get them at the highs. So when we got, and here we are, of course, at this high with the American Empire, when we got the COVID-19, in quotes, pandemic, I knew that it wasn't a pandemic, and I wondered why we had it. It was the top of the stock market and also the top of the warm, it was actually warm, wet at the point that happened, which was in January, February earlier this year. And yes, it turned out to be a manufactured cold virus, and it's not any more deadly than the annual flu, and that's all proven out. But we are going to get really deadly ones as time moves on and it gets colder and drier, which it is starting to do already. But it takes a long time to actually get to the bottoms of these really cold climates. Now, the other thing that you get at the tops of these cycles when it is warm and dry is you get testosterone levels that are really low. And we know that because there have been some studies recently that have told us that before those studies came out that linked testosterone to low birth levels, we only knew that we got really low birth levels at the tops here. There is lots of data on, for example, the top of the Roman Empire, where some of the Roman emperors were pleading with people to have more children because they had very low testosterone or very low birth rates, which we've now equated with testosterone. Now, the interesting thing about testosterone as being the hormone that is very low right now, because that's what we have. We're at about 150 to 180 year low. And you can have seen in the last 10 years, a lot of headlines came out to that effect, saying from a number of different governments around the world worrying about the low birth rate. And that's going to go on for some time, but gradually as it starts to get colder, the birth rate is going to go up. But the low testosterone is the hormone in the body that allows us to think critically. And when that is very low, the critical thinking gets very low as well. And you can see that the decision making and the things that are going on around the world are being affected in that way. When you get low testosterone, the next hormone that takes over is cortisol. And cortisol, of course, is fear and anxiety. And so we have, as I said, 150 to 180 year low in testosterone, and cortisol is very high. So what you're getting is a normal flu bug that is creating all kinds of fear in people because it's not any more deadly, and that is caused by this cortisol being the primary hormone at the moment. And you're getting the media, of course, harping on that and making it a much bigger thing. And of course, there's a lot lying in the background of that, which I don't have time to get into right now. But that's the kind of thing that you get when you get these highs and in the birth rate, and then it gets lower in temperature, and our testosterone tends to go up. The other thing you get at these highs, you call it the period of the woman, partly because of the testosterone lows. I would think that the estrogen becomes more dominant, and you get the women become more dominant in society when men are not so. You also get a lot of homosexuality and differences in gender or a meshing of the genders, if you will, at these tops. If you remember Rome and the Roman baths, and also in Greece at these highs, homosexuality is always very high at these tops, and we're seeing that today. And at the bottom, the men are more dominant. So these are all traits that is very important, I think, to understand, and that will give you a good idea of what's going on in the world. Here we are back to my main chart of the 4,000 years, showing all of the different empires that grew up, and we go through, when I want to go look at Rome, and Rome is right there, the Roman Empire, and it always starts with international wars as they grow in size, and this was the top of Sparta, this little spike here. This was the top of Greece, the ancient classical Greece, and it got taken over by Rome. It got conquered in about 200 BC, somewhere around that time. So we're going to start there, and we're just going to talk about what happened at the top of the Roman Empire and then how it started to collapse on the downside. And on the downside, of course, you always have civil wars. In this case, they also had a lot of inflation on the downside, where they really destroyed their money, and they had huge armies, which they raised the minimum wage for the armies. Does that sound something we've gone through recently? But it's the same old pattern that we go through. So we'll go take a look at Rome. Here is 225, right actually it's over here. Rome defeats Greece. I guess it was a little bit later than that, at about 150 BC, and they had civil wars, and there was a Greek rebellion in here, and it's just a very unsettling time whenever it is cold and dry. Then, of course, Rome grew, and you have all the imperialistic wars in here, and they grew. Many countries conquered countries. Pompey was a general that was very popular in those days, and he actually vied with Caesar for the dictatorship when we got to the top here. And Julius Caesar was in 49. He ruled from 49 to 44 BC. And of course, he declared himself a dictator. So at the tops of these cycles you get, and you can think of Trump that way, some people think he's a dictator. You also get, there's other traits that you get. There's always a lot of homosexuality. You can remember the Roman baths were very big in here. There was also a call for more people for people to have more kids because they had very low birth rates, and so that's part and parcel of this testosterone thing. So there ended up being a lot of fear as we go into the colder, drier periods, and of course then you start to get migrations, you get invasions, and you start to get civil wars. They also had things like the games, the Colosseum, and you know that they used to have, of course, lions and tigers, and they would have those games that went on. I always think about it at the top of these cycles, very much like the NFL. They have major sporting events, and that was the Coliseum in those days. And we have sort of the NFL and so hockey and some of the other big sports that are at their peak right now, and of course starting to fall apart. So we had Jesus Christ that was alive from 4 BC to 30 AD, and that usually happens because we had Muhammad in the 800s or 600s, I guess it was, and he appeared with the Islamic religion right after the top, just as it starts to get cold. So this is a little inference from Wheeler in terms of Christ appeared here, and I put this picture up here so that you would know that he was at this particular time. There was another dictator after Caesar, and what happened with Caesar, of course, he called himself dictator, and then all of the other senators were very jealous of him. They had stolen their power. He had stolen their power, and they assassinated him. And you've got the same sort of thing if you think about the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in the U.S. with Trump. They're trying to remove him from office. This also happened in England with Queen Elizabeth, and we will get to that shortly. So this is a similar trait that happens at the tops of all of these cycles. So you have tyranny, corruption, and it ends up in civil wars. So after Caesar was killed, there was a civil war here. There were other civil wars and a plague, the Antonine Plague, which I mentioned to you in here, and then it got warm, and we had a good dictator. Oh, here's one more. Domitian was a dictator from 81 to 96 AD, and he was tyrannical, authoritarian, and he referred to himself as God. And then you move on to cold and arid, and you get civil wars that happen in here. They also devalued their money on the downside, and you get that's called inflation. Whenever we have inflation, it's devaluing your money. So there are certain traits that happen at the tops of all of these cycles. They're exactly the same. You can pretty well set your watch by them when you get at the tops of them, and we're seeing that same sort of thing happen today. Now, the next period we'll go look at is Elizabethan England, and that's just in this period here. It was a 172-year cycle high, so it was warm and dry at the top, but it was overall a much colder period. In fact, the Maunder minimum was down here at about it was actually after 1663, but the cycle bottom was at 1664 when we had the fire of London and the bubonic plague. They always have interesting events that happen right on the cusp or right at the cycle turning point. And 1492, for example, was another one which I'll touch on, and that was the discovery of America, but it was also a cycle top at that particular time. So we'll just go look at Elizabethan England. Here we are with Elizabethan England, and boy, there's a lot going on in this particular chart. We'll start with 1492. I'm just going to hit the highlights here. I may miss a few little things just in the interest of time. 1492, I mentioned to you Christopher Columbus. It was a high, and of course he discovered America at that time, 1492. And we had the bonfires of the Vanities here at about the same time. It was actually about 5 years after this at 1497. And it was the government convinced a whole bunch of people in big groups to burn artwork, to burn multitudes of books. It was really an attack on free speech, and that happened in 1497. So you always get these attacks on free speech, and that continued all through this high, because in Elizabethan England, he tried to say, Queen Elizabeth didn't allow anybody to publish a book, even though they had had the printing press in the 1300s. Nobody could publish a book unless it was approved by the government. And so we're seeing that same sort of thing happening with the tech giants. It's the same pattern, and you see it over and over and over at these authoritarian highs. But this was the end of absolute monarchy and the end of feudalism when it got colder and drier. But going back to the beginning here, we started off with this is the temperature in red, and this is the rainfall. And we always have a golden age every 100 years. And the golden age here was after the 1500s. We had the Reformation, of course, which was under Henry I, but we also had this Renaissance period where we had Leonardo da Vinci, we had Michelangelo, and a number of artists and craftsmen that created all kinds of art that is still sought after today. You get one of these golden ages, as I mentioned, every 100 years. If you move ahead to the 1800s, which is off this chart, at the beginning of the 1800s, you had one of classical music, where we got the Beethovens and the Bachs and all of those fantastic, I still listen to the music today, musicians, composers that were in the early 1800s. You can go back to the last 100 years, and you can think of the time in the 60s where we had the Beatles, we had Elton John, we had all of these fabulous songsters, if you want, that were creating new music. Elvis Presley, all that period, and that was a golden age for the last 100 years that we had, and we're not going to have another one for a while. But we had Henry VIII with the Reformation, and I said he's a little bit like Donald Trump. He had a problem with one of his wives that he couldn't get the marriage annulled, and that was because he was having a fight with the Pope. The Pope wouldn't do it, and the Pope was in Rome, so he split from the Roman Catholic Church and created the Church of England. And this was a theme that went on all through this temperature high here. It was back and forth. For example, Henry VIII became the Church of England, the one that founded it. And then he went on to his child, Edward VI, who was also Protestant. And then that moved on to Bloody Mary. Bloody Mary was a Catholic, and during her reign, it was only for about 5 years, she burned 300 Protestant heretics at the stake. This was really, and you can think about these highs. Life becomes something that is very cheap. They were lopping off heads left and right. And in fact, Elizabeth did that to Mary Queen of Scots, who was her competitor for the throne. Later on, towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, she had Mary Queen of Scots sent to the guillotine. Now, Mary Queen of Scots, during the reign, and this is the palace intrigue that goes on. I mentioned the top of Rome, where we had all of the senators that eventually got rid of Caesar. You can think of everybody against Donald Trump. At this period of time, it's the same old story. So Mary Queen of Scots had to leave Scotland, where she was actually the queen. I won't go into the details again for time, but she had been sitting in England and trying to communicate with Elizabeth, which really would have nothing of it. And she was next in line for the English throne if Elizabeth did not have any children, which of course she didn't. So Elizabeth had her head lopped off, and it's just one of those interesting stories at the top of this high in both temperature and in rainfall. And you can notice how it suddenly started to get colder here, and then we got into deadly plagues and the things that happened towards the downturn, and the English Empire started to fall apart. In fact, you had the Spanish Armada that was towards the end of Elizabeth I's reign. There were other things that were happening during this period. We had Shakespeare, of course, who was this was another out of the golden age. This went on for some time, and Shakespeare, a lot of homosexuality. You can think of the Globe Theatre, where they had men in all of the parts for a period of time, and so that was another theme that continues on at these highs. Shakespeare, it's interesting, he had a lot of comedies during this period, but after Elizabeth died, after 1603, and it started to get colder and drier, that's when his tragedies started. So all of his plays turned really dark during that period until his death. So that's another thing that went on. We had other, because of the Golden Age, Galileo from 1564 to 1642. So he started back in here, and of course he had all kinds of scientific achievements. Of course, during the time of Galileo and the absolute monarchy, the Roman Catholic Church believed, and so did the English Church, believed that the earth was the center of the universe and everything revolved around the earth like the sun. But of course, Galileo proved or had the science that proved the opposite, but the Roman Catholic Church locked him up when it got cold and dry. So all of these bad things happen to people that are against the establishment. You can think today about Edward Snowden, currently living in Russia, Julian Assange, which is in all kinds of trouble. There is always an attack on freedom of speech, and there's always lots of tyranny at the tops of these cycles. Then we got into James I up here, 1603, after Queen Elizabeth had died. And that is, of course, the King James version of the Bible. You know, he's a very weak leader, though. And then the plague started down in here as it got colder and drier. And they went into British civil wars, which lasted for a good 10 years. And again, this is the kind of thing that happens whenever it gets colder and drier. You get big revolutions, and revolutions. There was a Glorious Revolution as well, but I guess I should lead up to that, where Oliver Cromwell took over power for a period of time in 1653, and actually he had beheaded Charles I and took over and became a dictator for that period, and dissolved Parliament, had his own Parliament, but he was really the dictator for a while, and that devolved into a civil war as well. During that period, in 1664, for example, we had the bubonic plague, fire of London in 1665, where all of London pretty well burnt to the ground. So bad things happen when it turns cold and dry. They always do. And then we had a little bit later on habeas corpus, so it started to move towards democracy with these civil wars and all the revolutions, because people rise up against their governments and they demand that they don't get locked up. And habeas corpus, of course, is you have to have a trial very, very quickly after you are accused. You can't just throw somebody in jail and let them lie there for months and months and months. You have to look after them very quickly. And also the Bill of Rights in 1689. So these things came in, and after one of these civil wars, we had the Glorious Revolution. And the Glorious Revolution, there were revolutions during this period of 1988 to 89 all across Europe. Almost every country had a bloody revolution or revolution of some kind. The Glorious Revolution was a bloodless revolution in England, where the population asked William of Orange, William and Mary had been the daughter of Charles I, who had, of course, had his head lopped off, but they were in what we know as the Netherlands now, and they were the king and queen, and they asked them to come and be the king and queen of England. So there were revolutions all across Europe. You tend to get this when you go into cold and dry. We're going to end up with a revolution in many countries around the world as we have people that revolt against what's happening with the government, this authoritarianism. You get these revolutions that spring up like wildfire, if you want, during these periods of cold and dry. So that is going to happen. It is a given. It has happened every single time when you get a major cycle top that we had in 1664. And of course, this was in a very cold period. It actually ended up being the Maunder minimum starting about 1645 into the early 1700s, where it was very, very cold. And we're moving into that period. And that was, as I mentioned to you, the end of about 700 years. So here we are down at the bottom here with the Maunder Minimum. Here was the British and Spanish empires just in here, and I've shown you what happened there. It got colder and drier. And then, of course, in 1492, we had America. I mentioned that got discovered, and gradually over time they started the 13 colonies that split from England and created a great big empire over time as it got warmer and wetter. And so I hope you can see by me taking you through some of these examples from history how a lot of these traits just happen over and over and over. So knowing this, you can tell what's going to happen next. Now, I have covered a lot of information in this hour because really, to get a whole picture, you have to get into a lot of detail and some examples. So there's really no other way to do it, to explain cycles. But I want to take just a couple of minutes to go through the main traits, because I've talked about a lot of them. So you can think of this as a summary of this move from a hot, dry cycle high to a cold climate, which is going to be cold and dry. And these are the kinds of things that we should be seeing now at this very warm high, and these things will change going forward. So we've got authoritarianism, we've got huge government debt. In fact, we have more debt than we've ever had all over the world, and that is a gigantic bubble that is going to burst, and we're going to have a major stock market crash. But it's also going to change, like it did in the 1700s. It's going to change our financial system, and that is probably already obvious to you, but it's not going to do it in the way that central bankers would like. And if you go to my site, which is thetruthsage.com or worldcyclesinstitute.com, you will get those addresses coming up at the end here. You'll find more information on all of this. And at thetruthsage.com, there is a place where you can actually get a subscription, and on an annual basis, I put out newsletters and videos to tell you what is happening, what is really happening, the truth, and also how to stay safe, how to keep your wealth, and all of those good things, how to make sure that your kids are going to be better off in the future. Those are the things that I spend my time on these days. So we've gone through government debt, tyranny, socialism. You're seeing that very much in the U.S. being the empire of the day, and also in some of the other countries like Australia, in Canada. A lot of them are getting hit very, very hard. Riots, class struggles, poor versus rich. We have the 99% and the 1%. There's Nancy Pelosi with her let them eat ice cream. So it's just the same old pattern over and over. And so the crash is going to take care of a lot of this and bring back a lot of equality in terms of the financial situation. We're going to go into civil wars and a revolution. In the U.S. is very close to a civil war. That is going to happen for sure. Migrations we've had over the last few years. The big migration now is going to be from the city to the country as people get closer to food and water, which is really what you want to do, is be closer to food and water, because transportation systems are starting to break down, and that's going to be more so as time goes on. The other thing is safety, and we're going to have a lot of riots in cities, less so in the country. We'll have a major stock market crash, an economic meltdown, and we're going to go into deflation. So one of the things that my site spends an awful lot of time on, thetruthsage.com, and also the World Cycles Institute, is helping you understand deflation, because we really haven't had that in our lifetime. And that is a good thing for us, not a good thing for central bankers. They don't want to get into deflation at all, and that's why you're seeing this push for a new currency, and it isn't going to work. What they want to do is try to inflate their way out of our problem. But once deflation takes hold, you can't stop it. We're going to have food shortages and starvation. One of the things that I didn't make obvious was just before we get into this cold, dry period, we always have flooding. And we've had that over the last 5 years or so all across the world, and it destroys crops. It destroys the land, and it also causes food shortages. Also, with it going into colder weather, it shortens the growing season, and so we're going to have challenges in that area. Pandemics later on as it gets colder, but we shouldn't be seeing them yet. We have weak leaders, that's readily apparent. A lot of corruption. Corruption is just going, I can't believe the amount of corruption there is out there. So that's going to come out. The truth comes out at these cycle tops, and you're going to see more of that as time goes on. Palace intrigue, propaganda. I mean, you can't even look at the mainstream media anymore because it's all propaganda, and you can see that in countries around the world. And I've talked about the lower birth rate and fear. So those are the key traits that you're seeing around you. We always get these at these cycle highs. We had it in Elizabethan England. We had it at the top of the Roman Empire. So it's all think of it as a formula, and we're going to see civil wars. The end of this is always much better because as it gets colder and drier, we're going to see more democracy. We're going to get rid of all of these leaders. There's going to be revolutions taking down governments, and it will eventually all be for the better. So it's happened before, over and over and over again, and it's happening this time again right on schedule. Here are my two sites where you'll find a lot more information. TheTruthSage.com is where you will get information on how to stay safe, and these are some of the things that I cover, and very, very much more. I put in a lot of the truth in a lot of articles, the actual stories about what is taking place with both this crazy pandemic, the authoritarianism, and the people that are trying to take over the world, if you want, the central bankers. You've got the World Economic Forum. You've got all of the corruption involving China. And so all of that is ongoing. There are going to be some really interesting developments over the next couple of years. And we're looking at a market top in 2021. So there still is time to prepare. There is time to figure out or even figure out where you're going to live. I think that's a very important aspect of life going forward. And this really is going to be a great awakening. There's no other way of putting it. And we're going to get a lot of the corruption out. We're going to get all of the truth out. And so my wish for you is to stay safe and that you learn as much as you can about how your money is changing and that you get to a very safe place away from all the riots and all the chaos that is going to develop over the next few years. Here's my two sites, and take care all. Thank you very much for listening.